learned at any other. No one who's an expert on cryptocurrency governance, because this has been a very, very emerging thing, and we've had one vote that wasn't particularly contentious, and there have been a couple other votes. There's not a huge body of like years and years of experience, so I'm drawing analogies from other domains, other projects, and speculation about the future. Not anything where we've got a lot of concrete data. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of opportunity to explore things here. Just as a quick introduction to Tezos, Tezos is a base layer blockchain. Governance on-chain is one of the main differentiators. Written in OCaml, started by Arthur and Kathleen Brightman a couple years ago. It's a pretty big project now. We've got maybe 500 validator nodes that are called bakers in our system. It's a proof-of-stake system. $800 million market cap, some number of market cap, reasonably that, a reasonable number of users and stuff like that. It's a relatively established project in the cryptocurrency space, in that we're almost going to reach our first year anniversary of a production network. So yeah. And really, we were designed to be decentralized from the start. As a proof-of-stake system, there's sort of a easy way to choose to be centralized. You pick either a fixed validator set or a very small validator set that all coordinate through some out-of-band means. Like Facebook, where you have an association where you pay $10 million each to join, or some other projects where they have a much smaller number of validator nodes that are pre-selected, can communicate very closely. We're permissionless to join and become a validator. You basically need to have a certain amount of assets to do so. Approximately $10,000 worth of assets is required to be a validator, and to do it safely, you could do it with a low-end computer and an $80 hardware device. So it's a pretty low bar. It's not a zero bar, but there is a bar to cross to be a participant. And it can scale to a very large number of participants. Yeah, so we're in this thing. It moves around all the time. Building in on-chain governance was a goal from day one. And we basically have a system where you can propose a proposal to upgrade the network in basically any way. There's a voting procedure that's laid out now, but there's sort of a meta-governance issue where, in fact, this voting system itself could be changed by a proposal at a subsequent date. We've had one specific proposal that's gone through that made a relatively small change between two things, and it was pretty successful. We had a very high participation rate. One of the unique things that we do to get high participation, which is one of the difficulties people have had with voting, especially if it's a non-contentious vote, is it's hard for a lot of there's a lot of individual holders. There's probably 50,000, 100,000 people that hold some quantity, and if you hold $10 worth of a cryptocurrency, your motivation to participate in a governance vote is a lot lower than somebody who holds a huge amount of it, and just the coordination difficulty. So we allow you to basically delegate your voting to the validator, the baking provider, which creates some interesting issues. So Tezos governance today has been, there's been one vote, there's been some stuff that worked, some stuff that didn't work. Some of the stuff that didn't work particularly well is we decided we were going to have like a straw poll in advance, a separate straw poll for how people were going to vote. Because the idea is that just like a board of directors in a company, you generally are not actually making the decision at time of vote. Usually it's something where people have either staked out positions and discussed how things are going to work out in advance and the vote's a formality, or there's something where there is a genuine disagreement between two groups of people and it's a contentious vote, but you at least understand the positions. It shouldn't be, the voting itself should not be where the discussion happens, the time of vote. And we thought it would be nice to have like third-party services where you can go and have a lightweight discussion forum, obviously existing discussion forums like Reddit and everything else. But there's a lot of factors that contribute to making that not the most effective possible way to do this. Things that are definitely going to be relevant to the Zcash community and to anyone that's anonymous cryptocurrency in general is going to be people have vested interest by virtue of holding an asset, and they're going to want to vote their interest. In VC, it's like talking your book. You're going to promote your company if it's not you're going to promote your own economic interests. So a lot of people are going to promote their economic interests. Plus, you can't really validate if somebody pushing a certain agenda is actually like what their holdings are if they remain pseudonymous. And it would be terrible if you had a great system where you got to remain pseudonymous or anonymous and private and everything else, but you had to leak your privacy specifically for the purpose of voting. So it would be nice to have a system where you can have discussions gated by knowing that someone has a certain threshold, maybe a $0 proof that they have a certain amount of an asset, or that they've made certain contributions in the past, but not disclose their identity beyond that fact. So there might be some interesting possibilities there. And yeah, we said the other issue is that straw polls, like if you have a real election where the result of that election is going to be an actual decision, people are pretty motivated to participate in that if they're going to participate at all. But if you have a straw poll where it's not really it's not binding, you're going to have a lot lower participation rate, and it's not going to be representative because the people who choose to vote in your like CNN exit poll at an election are going to be different than the people who actually vote in a voting booth. So, or the people who vote in when they get called at like 8 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday are going to be different voters than the people who vote in an election. So it's not really representative. It's not a good sample set. So those are things that didn't work so well, but things that did work so well, I think the fact that we had a vote, the fact that we were able to get pretty high participation in the voters, the fact that delegating the votes to a third party to handle voting worked really well, but a lot of that worked really well because it wasn't a contentious vote. I think the things that we're concerned about in the future, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to discuss, is what happens if there's a contentious vote where it's not Pareto optimal, like there's no equality, and maybe somebody's going to lose out, like certain class of people are going to lose out. In a proof of work system, traditionally there's this big conflict between different classes of users. You have end users that are using a system to transact, and then you have infrastructure operators, and you might have miners and other people. There's a lot of incentive if you had a change that benefits one class of users at the expense of another class of users for that class to block things. So it's pretty complicated, and that's a thing that the users are not a homogeneous user base. There's different stakeholders in a system like that. And I'd say that in terms of governance, one of the issues from a security perspective, so things that those are things that worked. Now there's things that will be required to make these systems work in the future. A lot of the stuff that we're working on in Tezos right now is working with either people issuing tokenized assets, like real estate funds that want to issue a fund of real estate assets, or industrial partners, like an automaker that wants to issue, use a token in some sort of way. They have a completely different administrative internal model of the world than you're a consumer. If you're a consumer that's taking an asset, wants to pay somebody else, you can be in and out of that asset. If you want to make a payment, you keep using this payment system. Like I used to use PayPal all the time for making payments, and then I switched to I think it was like Venmo or something because more people were using it. My switching costs were just switching using the thing. I switched from Alta Vista to Google, also very similar, pretty low switching cost for me. But if you're like a mortgage issuer that's going to issue a tokenized asset that's a 15 to 30 year mortgage or something as an asset-backed issuance, you have a pretty high commitment to a platform, and you can't just switch it out. So you're going to ask these questions up front of what happens if you have a system that has a governance model where decisions are made that you don't agree with. You can't just leave because you're stuck with it. And as a result, you won't even use it in the first place if you don't have confidence that the system will remain the same. Because the traditional governance models here, I mean, we can really look for examples at governments and groups of people in different contexts. Probably the most relevant things in very large-scale crypto systems are how like nation states or geographic force monopoly, whatever things work. But at small scale, it's how open source projects work. And there's probably some transition point, maybe around $10 to $100 billion in assets where it switches from being like open source governance model to like a government governance model. Depends on your users and a lot of other factors, but there's some transition point. Open source projects, you often end up with dictatorial single leader who just builds something, and no one really cares. If you create something, like if I create a new text editor, anyone can voluntarily use my text editor. You can switch to it, switch away from it, very low switching costs. It's not infringing on anyone's rights to use it. However, if I use something, like if you ran a country the same way, I'm not going to build like a house in a land where someone can like arbitrarily expropriate me on the same basis. So there's a lot of factors that determine whether you're going to be comfortable with a more decentralized or more centralized governance model. And I think these crypto projects, as they get bigger, are certainly approaching the point where you want a more formalized governance model that's more inclusive of all the stakeholders and all the users in the community. But yeah, I'd say the open source decision-making process, you have a single dictatorial leader, you have a small council, you have ultimately the fork option, which you don't have in a nation-state context as easily. You have maybe you can have an election, maybe you can have people leave. I've certainly moved countries many times, so it's an option, but in general, it's not as much of an option. The other thing is you can't really view governance as like a single monolithic thing. It's not like you're voting to, oh, should we continue this project or should we end this project? It's one kind of vote, but that's not the kind of vote that most people are talking about most of the time. Usually it's a tweak to the protocol, it's change to an algorithm, it's something, there's some change in behavior mechanism that is going to be decided upon, and these have different levels of impact and different levels of risk and uncertainty. So right now in Tezos, every change you make has the same bar to pass, and it's a pretty high bar. It's like an 80%. It's an iterated vote system, but it's a very high bar that's actually fairly difficult to meet, which is simultaneously too high a bar for a non-contentious change and too low a bar for a genuinely contentious change. So ultimately, what would make sense would be to have different decisions that have different impacts, that have different thresholds for voting, or perhaps different time delay. One of the concerns that large institutional users have is they might not watch they have their product cycle is like 2 or 3 years. They're probably not going to watch a project that like every day commit. And if you were to say, hey, we're going to have a vote in the next week that's going to completely destroy the use case that you've built for your quarter, your year, or whatever, they might even find out about it until after the vote's already concluded. So you need to make sure that these changes are at a time scale that's appropriate for the users and the scale of the change. But also, we've had a similar, as earlier with the bug discussion, if you have a critical chain-ending inflation bug or DDoS or some other situation that requires a quick fix, maybe a democratic vote process that would be appropriate for some sort of contentious change with winners and losers is not the right mechanism for doing it. So either you always have the option of forking, as say if you had a highly non-contentious, purely technical change, like suddenly some algorithm is outdated or something and needs to be made, or there's a typo or something, you could push that through as a hard fork and you're going to get pretty high adoption. But maybe it would make sense for your governance model, as was discussed, to include a way to at least notify people after the fact, or to have an expedited approval process for non-contentious technical changes. So I think this means basically in advance you're going to want to have a set of procedures and a set of limitations placed on what the entity can do, what the governance procedure does, that vary by the type of change that's going to be made. So certain parts of the code, like maybe there's a fundamental constitution for your blockchain that your balance is never going to be arbitrarily decreased. But things like the proof of work algorithm or some protocol detail is a mere instrumentality, and you don't really care so much about it. It's a technical breaking compatibility change for people, so that's a software type time scale of changing. Maybe you give people 3 or 6 months to make that update, but it's not a government level change, so it's a different form of governance. So you probably have different time scales for different kinds of things, different thresholds. One of the issues also is, I mean, obviously everyone likes to push decentralization, but a lot of projects do have a few entities that are more trusted or that are more visible or have more of a responsibility than others. Within the Tezos ecosystem, the Tezos Foundation has a huge amount of assets, and it is responsible for promoting Tezos, but it's not really operating the Tezos chain. It doesn't have any control over it. We can just make grants and we can make statements and things, but we have no influence over it particularly. We have indirect influence. We have no direct control. So one of the things we can do is we hold enough Tez that our voting policy itself is a large voting block, and we can have a voting policy that's articulated in advance of we will automatically accept any proposal except one that meets these certain negative characteristics, but we'll let other people decide for other things. For instance, like we would probably block a change that chose to take assets away from certain users in favor of other users. Like an asset rebalancing change we would block, but something about different algorithms or whatever we would just be okay with and let other people decide. The other thing is there's sort of a war in the general world outside of crypto on experts, and partially that's because some people are experts only in name and are not actually experts, or they have an agenda they're pushing. But I honestly would rather have a 12-year trained surgeon operate on me than somebody who thinks that the medical establishment is like hokey. So if there's a decision that has a technical component to it, I would like to have trusted sources provide some level of validation of that change. Maybe people run simulations on it, maybe people establish a reputation for every time there's a proposal for a governance change, they evaluate it on certain metrics. So maybe a legal guy says, I'm going to look at these changes and make sure they don't conflict with any IP rights in any of the major countries, because that would actually be a concern that if you committed a patented innovation into a blockchain, you could make it impossible for people to operate it in certain places, at least as institutions. So maybe somebody sits there and does a legal review, and then people decide, hey, I'm a voter, and I'm going to make sure that I check the legal review from this guy who's always had a good legal review and has been pretty impartial, but I don't actually care about his opinion about the economic model of it, only his statements about the legal portion of it. Maybe somebody else does a technical security review, maybe somebody else does a economic review. So maybe you establish people that sort of have or organizations that have sort of a reputation for analyzing things in different ways. Yeah, I think basically there's a fundamental question of how much of this is enforced by your blockchain or by protocols or by the system itself versus by social contracts, and which are enforced by different layers. In the Tezos ecosystem, you have bakers. The bakers as validator nodes basically vote their entire stack of all their end users that have delegated to them. They vote them one way. It's up to them how they choose to do the vote. A lot of them are polling their users for voting. Because we haven't had anything really contentious, it hasn't been an issue. The argument is that if you don't like the way your baker is going to vote, and they make a public statement about that, you choose to hand your vote to someone else. So that is a good argument. However, there's nothing really enforcing that at a technical level. So people will maybe over time establish a reputation of reliably voting the way they say they were going to vote, which is sort of an issue in the US political system. If you've ever followed the Electoral College, there's no actual obligation for the electors to vote in any particular way except by state law in certain places, so they could choose to do it. It's the same way with this. So maybe you end up with a policy decision by a baker, or maybe you have a technical control that's built in. Like one of the things we're working on at the foundation, because we have this huge amount of XTZ, is we're going to build some technical controls around how our voting system works. It'll automatically place basically the OK vote, and then to do anything else requires like a quorum of 4 or 7 of directors to vote a different way, and it'll be a very transparent process. So maybe a baker does that, or maybe a baker chooses to have a yes vote and a no vote that are separate bakers, but they're run on the same infrastructure, so they're basically being completely transparent and giving people the same quality of baking, but letting them pick there. So I think a lot of this stuff is going to be explored by people over time. But yeah, we were relatively successful in this one vote, and it had pretty high completion rate. The other thing there's a lot of stuff that's going to be really out of scope of the governance process itself, how individual actors work, and there's a very philosophical question of how much of this behavior should be enforced in software at the relatively difficult to change layers versus enforced in software by different entities. It's sort of like a federalism model. So maybe you have a blockchain that has certain guarantees made. The governance model for the blockchain says we'll never change balances for users unless there's like a 95% ultra super mega majority. If there's a 80% majority, we'll make certain other changes, whatever else. But individual participants might set their own policies. They might say something like, we run our keys inside an HSM. This HSM requires that a certain number of users it'll automatically vote in a certain way for certain users, or that we won't update we won't update the running code without also updating the source code in another place, because there's a lot of issues beyond how people decide they're going to work together fairly. Where people cheat. So you're going to end up with people that agree to one set of procedures, and then people through economic interest, accident, malice, for the lulls, choose to do different things other than they've committed to do. And you might end up with somebody who at time T, you audit them, they're perfectly great, like a wallet provider, and then they just change they distribute an evil version of source code or evil version of binary to a lot of end users and do something that they committed not to do. So yeah, I mean, overall, governance is a huge area of exploration. I think it's going to be something where people experiment with a lot of different techniques, a lot of different problems, and it makes more sense to try things, experiment, see what works. But there's the counter argument to that is that there's huge amounts of assets at risk in certain cases, and there's also commitments of resources to do engineering on certain things. So there's definitely incentive to make risky changes on things that have low value, on test networks, on systems earlier in their ecosystem, and less innovation on things that have larger assets. But it's going to be a very, very interesting place. And next we're going to have a governance panel where people discuss governance on different chains, and I'm looking forward to watching that and seeing how that works. I'd be happy to answer questions for the next 4 minutes if anyone has questions. Thank you.
So if I understood correctly, you were suggesting that some invariants of the system, like, say, balance preservation, would be enforced by the code and require a different voting threshold. So there are changes that are not politically contentious, but because they change how the protocol works, that if you got them wrong, they could potentially violate balance.
Yeah.
So, for example, sapling was not a politically contentious change, but it completely changed how balance preservation was implemented for shielded protocols. Yeah,
I think you definitely want to have the underlying economic reality be what makes the decision, if you can. However, in Tezos, the way it would most likely work is that we would scope it by module in the code base, and we would say touching this particular module costs a higher threshold to vote than making these other changes, just as how we implement it. So that would inform how you design the software in the first place, to try to eliminate side effects across modules, which would be less efficient in certain ways, but you might have to design the software in a different way to work around that. But yeah, it's definitely a concern.
Yeah, that's interesting. That might actually incentivize structuring the software more modularly.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to do. Yeah.
Thanks.
I wonder if there's some overlap between the wisdom of don't roll your own crypto and don't roll your own governance. Don't roll your own crypto because you can't learn anything just because I made a new cipher and no one broke it for a while. And in the same way, you don't maybe learn anything from just saying, okay, this mechanism worked on a simple non-contentious change. Really my question is, I wonder, like, what do you think you can learn from really small-scale governance experiments that take place, small environments before there's, a big contentious decision or a whole lot of money behind it, or what can we do to get more value out of empirical experiments?
Well, I think early on, just doing a pure hello world type test of can we actually get people to submit votes and things like that is required. I think you do need that level of testing. The decision-making process of how you make contentious decisions has been not tested. The instrumentality of how you choose to handle process votes and things like that was what we tested. That's now pretty solid. So I think the next thing is to have a contentious issue that is technically simple, where people make decisions there, to test that as a separate thing. Because I like testing things independently. Like one high-risk part of the experiment, everything else is low risk.
Are there any other smaller projects that you've seen experiments take place that you found most informative to look at?
I've seen, mostly I've seen internal discussions between people that are going to propose proposals to the Tezos proposal process and how they're thinking about it. That's probably the main area that I've seen interesting stuff happen, and then stuff outside of cryptocurrency.
Hi. With the concept of expertise, have you considered allowing people who hold a small amount of Tezos to be able to delegate their vote in different ways depending on the type of vote? For example, maybe a technical vote that they give to someone who's an expert in a technical field. And if you did consider that, what have you implemented it, and what sort of challenges did you?
I mean, that would definitely be an interesting thing to do. Right now, the vote is an all or nothing vote. So probably what you would do is you'd have the baker would have a policy of, we choose to delegate the technical decision to this guy, the legal decision to this guy, and other things like that, and you would move your entire vote to somebody who had a policy that you agreed with. I think over time, the roll size required to bake is going to get smaller, so you'll have smaller and smaller bakers. So eventually, baking is going to be something that has a very small number of representatives. Like, you get better representation if you have 10 people that you're representing versus if you're representing like 10 million people. So that's probably how it'll work. But it'll be an interesting area to innovate.
Thank you.
Hey, great talk. I think one of the most interesting and contentious kind of topics in blockchain governance right now is this question of kind of social versus technical governance. You have kind of blockchains like Bitcoin and to a very large extent Ethereum, where the kind of overwhelming feeling is that like we don't want any sort of social governance layer for various reasons. You know, the blockchain should be quote unquote neutral. Needless to say, I personally disagree with this, but I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts, if you have any thoughts or sort of what the kind of tenor of that conversation in the Tezos community looks like. Have you guys considered, I think probably you're quite strong on the technical governance front for various reasons. It's architected in that way, but any thoughts on like how social governance might happen, how like a constitution might be voted in, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think we have a voting mechanism so that we could then implement social policies on top of that. So we're still at the stage of trying to get people to come into the community. I think we don't have a particularly diverse community because we don't have real end user adoption and things like that. I'd rather have more end user type voices in the discussion and things like that before we really go down that path too much, because right now it's a bunch of people who are either true believers in the project or people who are interested in because it's an OCaml or it's French or some sort of idiosyncratic reasons. But yeah, I think over time, when people have more clear viewpoints and a lot of different valid viewpoints, it'll be an area that'll be really interesting. Maybe I think in person, like, there's the old thing about like you can yell at somebody on the internet for forever, but then you meet them and like meet up and you're pretty, even if you disagree with them on stuff. I think a technically mediated voting procedure is actually even worse than a flame war on a free-form discussion forum, because you just end up like poking the pain button over and over again. So I think you're probably having more social forums where people discuss stuff